to continue, we're looking at the age that is plausible for the worldwide flood. We have lots of evidence that there was one. Let's take a look at that. We'll look at K24. K24.htm. The date of the flood. And we're looking at 2459 BC as a possibility. 2459. Back up a little bit. Strict chronology forces the Tower of Babel into Abraham's time, so that's not feasible. We looked at 2167 BC as the year of Abram's birth. We already went over this. The flood must have occurred in the year 2459 BC and the judgment of the Tower of Babel between 2358 and 2119 BC, the lifetime of Peleg, according to the strict chronology interpretation, which so far has not worked out very well. When we turn to the Genesis account of Abram's journeys, however, we discover the international scene to have been quite different from that suggested by the above-mentioned dates for the flood and the judgment of Babel. Abram is certainly not depicted as one of the early pioneers from the land of Shinar who migrated to western territories that were only beginning to be settled 200 years after the judgment of Babel. Abram is certainly not depicted as one of the early pioneers from the land of Shinar who migrated to western territories that are only beginning to be settled 200 years after the judgment of Babel. I'm repeating myself here. Quite to the contrary, the Bible implies that the world of Abram's day with its civilizations and cities was ancient already, and we are left with the unmistakable impression that its peoples had only since been divided after the families, after their tongues, and their lands, and their nations. So, as we follow Abram in his wandering from Ur of the Chaldees to the land of Canaan, filled to overflowing with the Kenite and Kezanite and Amorite and Canaanite and the Girgazite and the Jebusites, and then follow him down into the land of Egypt with its pharaoh and its princess. And then we see going into Lot's rescue in the vicinity of Damascus after Lot and other captives from the 5 cities of the plain have been deported by the kings of Shinar, Elazar, Elam, and Goyim. And then we see him being met by a priest king, Salem, and later see him coming into contact with a Philistine king and Hittite landowners. We cannot help but feel that the judgment of God upon the Tower of Babel must have occurred many centuries before this time of Abram. Byron C. Nelson, before Abraham, points out that Genesis mentions 26 cities in Canaan alone during the days of Abraham. 7 of these are said to have had kings, presumably the 5 cities of the plain, at least, and have been in existence for there so long that their cup of iniquity was already full to the overflowing. This impression is confirmed by Jeremiah 47:4 and Amos 9:7, who informed us that the Philistines came into Canaan and not from Shinar, but rather from the west from Kephtor, which is the island of Crete. And Moses tells us that before the Philistines ever came to Canaan from Kephtor, the southwestern section of Canaan had been occupied by the Ephim. Thus, the Bible implies that Babel was judged long before 2358 BC. So we don't look at these genealogies as point for point chronology. Many individuals in biblical chronologies are not to be counted as firstborn sons. So within the genealogies of Genesis 11, there are additional indications that we are dealing with something other than a chronology. One of these is found in the statement of Genesis 11:26, and Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Taking the statement at face value, one might well conclude that Terah became the father of triplets in his 70th year, even as his grandson Isaac became the father of twins in his 60th year, Abram being the firstborn of the triplets. We are somewhat astonished, however, to discover upon further investigation that Abram was not the firstborn of the 3, and that Terah was not 70, but rather 130 years old when Abraham was born. So in Genesis 11:32, we read that the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran, while in 12:4 we find that Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Thus, if Abraham left Haran to go to Canaan after Terah's death, Abraham must have been born when his father was 130 years old. Now, the possibility of Abram's leaving Haran in 60 years before Terah finally died is excluded by Stephen's statement that from thence, when his father was dead, God removed him into this land where he was now dwelling. In the light of these considerations, we may paraphrase Genesis 11:26 as follows. And Terah lived 70 years and begat the first of his 3 sons, the most important of whom, not because of age, but because of the messianic line, was Abram. It is quite possible that only a small number of the patriarchs listed in Genesis 11 were firstborn sons. A comparison of 11:10, 5:32, and 8:13 suggests that Shem was not. A comparison of 11:10 with 10:22 suggests that Arpachshad was not either. And we have already seen that Abram was not. Actually, not one of the messianic ancestors in Genesis whose family background is known in any detail, such as Abel, Seth, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez, was a firstborn son. The year of begetting a first son, known in the Old Testament as the beginning of strength, was an important year in the life of the Israelites. It is this year, then, that not necessarily the year of the birth of the messianic link, that is given in each case in Genesis 11. Thus, we have clear evidence for the possible addition of a limited number of years from the lives of some of these patriarchs to the total years from the flood of Abraham. Genealogies then were not point for point, year by year, minute by minute. So begot in the chronologies often refers to more than one generation. Such terms as begot and the son of, which in English imply a father-son relationship, sometimes have a much wider connotation in the Bible. In Matthew 8:1-8 we read that Jorah begot Uzzah, but the 3 generations are omitted. In 1 Chronicles 26:24 we are told that Shebuel, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, was ruler over the treasures in the days of David. Here we have 400 years of generations skipped over between Shebuel and Gershom. But the most interesting case of all, in our opinion, is to be found in Exodus 6:20. Here we read that Aram took him, Jochebed, his wife's father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 157 years. Now, anyone reading this statement as it stands by itself would be forced to conclude that Aaron and Moses were the actual sons of Amram and Jochebed, for the text clearly states that she bare him Aaron and Moses. And immediately following this, we are given the number of the years that Aram lived, in a manner strikingly similar to that of the genealogy of Genesis 5. So it is with profound amazement that we turn to Numbers 3, and discover that in the days of Moses, the family of the Amorites, together with the families of Amram's 3 brothers, Ishar, Hebron, and Uzziel, numbered 8,600. Unless we are willing to grant that the first cousins of Moses and Aaron had over 8,500 living male offspring, we must admit that Amram was an ancestor of Moses and Aaron, separated from them by a span of 300 years. In the light of this, it is significant that the names of the actual parents of Moses and Aaron are not recorded in the narrative of Exodus 2, 1-10. So, keeping in mind this remarkable and enlightening example of how the Jews compiled their genealogies, we turn our attention once again to Genesis 11. Taking as a case for special study the central section of that genealogy, we read in verses 16-19. And Eber lived 34 years and begat Peleg, and Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters. And Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. And Peleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years and begat sons and daughters. For at least 2 seasons, this section of the post-Diluvian patriarchal genealogy is unusual and calls for careful consideration. First, we find here a sudden drop in the lifespan of the patriarchs that is unparalleled in the entire genealogy. Until the time of Eber, no post-Diluvian patriarch is said to have lived less than 433 years. But now, without any explanation, the lifespan drops to 239 and never exceeds that number again. This represents a permanent drop in lifespan of 45% as opposed to the 23% drop from Shem to Eber. So statistics don't work out. The second peculiarity about this section is that it contains the name of Peleg, of whom it is said in 10:25 that in his days was the earth divided. It has been generally conceded by Old Testament scholars that this explanation has reference to the judgment of Babel, at which time Jehovah scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth. But it is difficult to understand why it should be said of only of Peleg that in his days the earth was divided, if on the assumption that Genesis 11 is a strict chronology. Noah, Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, and probably Canaan were still living throughout the entire lifetime of Peleg. All of this leads us to submit the following proposition. At least in this section of Genesis 11, if not in other sections, we have warrant for assuming that the term Gigat, or Begot, is to be understood in the ancestral sense. From that fact, there is a sudden and permanent drop in the lifespan between Eber and Peleg, and also from the fact that Peleg is the only patriarch who is recorded as having lived at the same time of judgment upon Babel. We feel it justified in assuming that Peleg was a distant descendant of Eber. So, the objection might be raised at this point that Genesis 10:25 cannot allow for such a view. For in that passage we read that Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And how then could Peleg be a distant descendant of Eber, if we are told in this passage that Eber had two sons, of whom one was Peleg? Would not such a statement preclude the possibility of merely ancestral relationship? Ancestral, not complete, these genealogies. Indeed, there would be a serious objection were it not for our parallel case in Exodus 6:20. There we found that two sons were born unto Amram. But from the 3rd chapter of Numbers, we also discovered that Moses and Aaron were only two of the 8,600 living descendants of Amram's father. Now, the very same thing could be true of Genesis 10:25, where we read that two sons were born unto Eber. By analogy, then, with Exodus 6:20, then it seems that quite possible that Peleg and Joktan were only two of the many living descendants of Eber at the time of God's judgment upon Babel. So, summarizing the arguments of this entire discussion, we may say that the lack of an overall total of years for the period from the flood to Abraham, the absence of Canaan's name and years in the Hebrew text, the symmetrical form of the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, and the inclusion of data that are irrelevant to a strict chronology, the impossibility of all the post-Diluvian patriarchs being contemporaries of Abraham, the biblical indications of a great antiquity for the judgment of Babel, and the fact that the messianic links were seldom firstborn sons, the analogy of begot being used in the ancestral sense allow the existence of gaps of an undetermined length in the patriarchal genealogy of Genesis 11. So we're left with that. So others try to resolve the problem by inserting centuries into the chronologies, but that can't resolve the problem either. Gain new popularity in evangelical circles when we do this, allows for gaps totaling scores of hundreds of thousands of years, and that the flood as well as the creation of Adam must be dated in harmony with the timetable of uniformitarian anthropology. Well, see, you try to read something into it, this is what you get. Worse problem than when you started with. Several schools of thought, 3 schools concerning the date of the flood among Christians who accept the anthropological timetable. Those who believe the flood was geographically universal tend to date the flood several 100,000 years ago. Those who believe it destroyed all men but was geographically local would date it from about 15,000 to perhaps 100,000 years ago. And those who believe it only destroyed part of the race would tend to date it less than 10,000 years ago. In other words, the more catastrophic the flood is conceived to have been, the more remote it must have been if the human race is as old as modern anthropologists claim. According to some, the Paleolithic cultures in Europe and the Near East, such as these, are to be dated between 25,000 and 8,000 BC, while the lower cultures, such as these here, are to be dated from several 100,000 years to about 25,000 BC. But even if the most conservative estimates of modern anthropology are accepted, we are still asked to think in terms of 100,000 years of human history at the very best. However, the Bible's chronology cannot be extended over tens of thousands of years ago. We have to stretch the genealogy of Genesis 11 to cover a period of over 100,000 years. It's to do violence to the chronological framework of all subsequent Bible history and prophecy. So we'll go into that next time.